to THA Talks, for free thought and open minds.
And for freedom of speech.
Hello, I'm Paul Obitelli and welcome to another edition of THA Talks, the alternative podcast show from the UK. Our talks include news, conspiracy, spirituality, the occult, science, history, art, philosophy, religion, and much more. If you'd like to check out our full archive, just go to www.thatalks.com to listen to or to download all our free content. And if there's anyone who'd like to contact us and give us some feedback or recommend a guest for the show, you can email us info@thatalks.com. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the show via our RSS feed, and you can also find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, and many other podcast directories out there. Well, hello everyone, thanks for tuning in again. I'm sure you've been as engaged with what's going on in the world as I have over the last few weeks. I mean, here in the UK, we've certainly got Brexit, which is all over the place at the moment. I mean, it's anyone's guess that's what's going on with that. I am due to get John White on the show to have another talk about that because there's just so much stuff. He's got some interesting perspectives of that. He's been live streaming a lot from his channel, so if you want to check out that, he's doing that quite a lot now, but I will get him on the show soon for a nice chat about what's going on. And of course, there's the horrific shooting that happened in Christchurch in New Zealand, with, I think it's about 50 dead now. It may be more. Horrific stuff, and it's just, this stuff is just too much in the news now. I'm sure that it's going to throw up some really controversial views and things going around, and this is something we may cover in the future. So yeah, some real the news is just crazy at the moment. We've certainly we're not shy of controversy on this show. We've got a guest for you today who's got a fantastic CV and some really fascinating subjects. Some may regard as extremely controversial, but that's what we like here. This evening I'm going to be talking with Dr. Alexander Jacob. He was born in Madras, India, and obtained his Master's in English Literature from the University of Leeds and his Ph.D. in the History of Ideas from the Pennsylvania State University. His post-doctoral research was conducted at the University of Toronto while he was a visiting fellow at the Departments of Political Science, Philosophy, and English Literature. As I say, he's written loads and loads of books, and we're going to be touching on, firstly, we'll be touching on natural philosophy, which covers cosmology and solar worship of the Indo-Europeans, the ancients of the tribes around Europe and beyond. Really interesting stuff. You know, this is obviously can relate to a lot of the pagan stuff we've gone into over the years here, which we're always interested to bring up. And we'll also be treading into a political philosophy. Now, I guess you just got to be straight up and I'm looking at this. I'm thinking fascism. I think that's what we're going to be touching on. Whether Alexander has a different view of what this is, but it's certainly going into the origins of what that was. We've touched on that on the show before. A lot of people view it as controversial, but we're not just talking about what's thrown around today. We're not talking about what's thrown at the Nigel Farages and the UKIPs and anyone that's got kind of like a nationalistic, pro-conservative view of things, which a lot of people just use fascism and that term so loosely. I get the feeling we're going to be speaking about the real nit and gritty of it today. And whether we're for it or against it, I think we can all learn something. So without any further ado, Alexander is here with us now. How are you doing, Alexander?
Well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm good. It's great to have you on the show. I've just been looking at all the books that you've written, which is a massive pile of books to get through. I obviously haven't been able to read all your books leading up to this, but I have a feeling a lot of what we're going to go into, some of our listeners, it's going to be very new to them. And obviously it's got some quite complex stuff. So to start off with, it would be good if we could break into the natural philosophy side of your research, and then later on we'll go into the more political stuff. So to start off with, I mean, a lot of people that may not know what your work is and what you're about, you could introduce yourself and let us know who you are, what your passion is, and what's brought you to it.
Well, I'm an intellectual historian. I did my doctorate in intellectual history at the Pennsylvania State University. And I did that actually on an English philosopher of the 17th century, Henry More of Cambridge. And he was a natural philosopher. Before that, I had done John Milton at the University of Leeds for my English literature masters, but also from Cambridge. And so, yes, I specialized in Henry More's Cambridge Platonism, as it is called, because the Neoplatonism that they dealt with is the closest, actually, to Indian philosophy. So that was my initial work, and then I had produced many editions of Henry More's works, some of them translations from the original Latin that had never been done before, and I don't think will be done again. So that was Henry More, and my initial studies in natural philosophy. And then I did, when I was doing my postdoctoral research at the University of Toronto, a whole book on natural philosophy called De Naturae Natura. It's a study of idealistic conceptions of nature and the unconscious. It is actually at the moment being translated into German. And so this one starts from antiquity and goes to the early 20th century, Carl Gustav Jung, in fact. And so it studies, various conceptions of nature in European philosophy. So that is the extent of my studies in natural philosophy per se. But then I've also done Indo-European mythology and cosmology, which is related to it, because cosmology is, in natural philosophy, it is also the basis of the religion of the ancient Indo-Europeans, which I've studied in 3 works, actually. Atman, which is a study of the solar cosmology of the Indo-Europeans. Brahman, which is a study of the solar rituals of the Indo-Europeans. And most recently, Indo-European mythology and religion, which was published in Australia, a collection of essays on the same subject.
Right. I mean, yeah, this is what I'd like to touch on first, because and we've had a lot of people on the show that's into European paganism, heathenry, Asatru, Odinism. Obviously, even within those groups, there's a lot of kind of controversy, the political side of it, and the different interpretations of what the faith is and what it's about. And obviously, when you go back in time to the Indo-Europeans, which you can also translate as the Aryans and stuff, you get more controversy. Obviously, in your work, you haven't been afraid to touch on all of this and stuff. So let's go right into the meat of who were the Indo-Europeans. I mean, there's some people listening now, they haven't researched a lot of this and they're very fascinated by it. Let's start from the ground up. But who were the Indo-Europeans?
Well, Indo-European is a linguistic term originally, and Indo-Germanistic means all the languages that stretch from India to Germany that were discovered to have common etymological connections. And so originally it began as a linguistic study, and then it was used as a synonym of the Aryan, especially in later 19th century and early 20th century Germany. And of course, the use that the National Socialists made of that term. So it became very, very racial and politically conflicted. So that is the Indo-European term as an academic subject. But I have a different view of the Indo-Europeans. I believe that it is a term that should be used for the Noachidian race. In the Table of Nations, in the book of Genesis, you have Noah having 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And I believe that all 3 derive from a common source, and they should all be called Indo-Europeans because they have the same religious system and insights and so on. So only the Japhetic, that is the Aryan, is normally considered Indo-European by European nationalists at the moment, for instance, or even national socialists during the right. But I believe that is only a limited use of the term. So paganism, well, I know there's a lot of interest in the revival of paganism, but that is only a reaction to Christianity. It does not really, show much academic depth in its practices. It's really very difficult to recover an ancient religion that has been lost for thousands of years. And also because of the general interest in things Aryan because of the Reich. So it seems more a political kind of reaction than anything really spiritual. Because if you really wanted spirituality, I don't see why you could not continue in the spiritual core of a Catholic religion, which is the basis of European culture for hundreds of years, or even of some parts of mystical Protestantism or something.
Oh, I can hear some pagans reacting to that now. Yeah. Well, I mean, right. you touched on the National Socialists. That I want to hit on that point because I've read lots of stuff, and you hear, Hitler or Hitler's henchmen, whoever it was researching a lot of ancient paganism, and they wanted to sort of dig for the Germanic pagan roots to as their native racial religion. How much true? I don't know what's conspiracy, what was true. How much were the Nazis or Hitler how interested were they in Germanic paganism and the old Aryan Indo-European spirituality? Was it as much of a thing as some make out?
Well, it was originally. The whole movement arose out of esoteric clubs and so on, that researched Aryanism. The swastika, for instance, was used from scientific researches into the ancient Aryan past, because swastikas are normally found only in India and not in Germany or anywhere, perhaps in the Ukraine, but that was discovered much later. So they actually did research into the subject and hoped to revive the ancient Aryan religion, which they thought was common between the Eastern and Western Aryans. But they made no distinction between Eastern and Western and thought that the Western Aryans were, in fact, the original Aryans. Anyway, they adopted the symbols and really wanted to revive it. So that was the origin of the National Socialist movement. Hitler belonged to it, but he had no particular interest in reviving paganism. In fact, he mocked it at times. Himmler was the esoteric enthusiast. He, of course, had his own department of race and resettlement and so on. And the Ahnenelbe and so on, that sought to do research into the ancestral traditions of the Germans and the Aryans, and he sent teams to Tibet, of all places, to seek the original home of the Aryans or something. So, yeah, there was an interest, but not on the part of Hitler. It was Himmler, actually.
Okay, because it's interesting. The Indo-Europeans. It was quite actually a diverse tribe, so to speak, wasn't it? How far did it spread? Obviously we know they're in Europe to India, right?
Right. So my conviction is that all these three branches, the Japhetic, the Semitic, and the Hamitic, derived from one source, and so you will find them widespread from India up to Ireland. But they don't all represent the same branches of the original family. So the Eastern European, which is originally, Eastern Aryan, which is the oldest Aryan branch, Japhetic branch, is based roughly in the Ukraine. That much is certain, because we found in archaeological digs that is where the Eastern Aryan branch developed and spread. Okay, and they came down to India, and they participated in the development of Indian culture later. Okay, that is the Eastern branch, and this is a Slavic branch, essentially Slavic, because Sanskrit actually has closest links with Slavic and Slavonic languages. So if you go to Moscow, you'll be struck. If you know Sanskrit, you'll be struck by the similarity of sounds and vocabulary that this ancient Indian language has to Russian, similarly with Czech and Polish and so on, though they are Western Slavic branches of the Slavic family. Okay, so this is the original Aryan family. It includes also the Iranians, by the way. Then there's the Western Aryan, and this includes the Germans and the Celts. Now, they, of course, spread through Europe quite early, and I believe that this branch must be somewhat similar to the Eastern Aryan as well, because they come from the same family, and they also share the same genes. I think nowadays there's a lot of genetic research and DNA and so on. I'm not an expert in these matters, but I know that the Eastern Aryan are predominantly R1A, and the Western are R1B. So they both belong to this R haplogroup. But the Nordics have a different haplogroup altogether. These are completely blonde and blue-eyed and Scandinavian. They are actually I, and they're related to J, which is another West Asian branch. So the spread of this Aryan religion, I believe, is originally from the Ukraine, in India and Iran and so on, and also in Anatolia. Anatolia, of course, is a great center of cultural development of ancient Indo-Europeans. And then it moved from Anatolia through the Balkans and Central Europe and reached ultimately the Scandinavians, who actually are not part of the same branch at all. They're a completely different one. That's why they're quite different in appearance also. And it is their admixture with the more Southern Aryan groups that has produced a lot of racial variety in Europe itself. So now, when you consider this, all this organism and so on comes from Anatolia. In fact, Snorri Sturluson, who is the author of the Eddas, actually describes the movement of Odin. Odin is obviously a tribe that moved from Anatolia up to Central Europe and Scandinavia. So if that is the case, then the Scandinavians and so on got a religion that is not originally their own. It came from no southern parts. And so even Odinism is not original to the Scandinavians any more than Catholicism.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously, I think at the moment, because in Europe you've got obviously huge multiculturalism and a lot of immigration and stuff. I think what people, a lot of sort of nationalist thinking people, they embrace the ethno sort of side of it because it's very culturally strong and stuff. And obviously that causes a lot of division. You've got certain aspects of the religion from the recurring religion that are they're described as the universalists that are very everyone. It's an everyone religion like Christianity or Islam or whatever. It's for everyone. Whereas the other are a bit more tribal and says, no, this is our religion. This is the European people's, the culture. It's where their sort of ethnicity has come from, kind of thing. Where do you stand with that?
Oh, I mean, I'm rather skeptical of the creation of a new religion among any peoples. Himmler tried that. I don't think he succeeded very well. He had, of course, an SS to experiment with, and they all, followed his kind of budding religion and its rituals. But it's only for them, and it's just, a few precepts of loyalty and honor to the nation. It's a kind of nationalism, with a religious glow, as it were, to it. And I think the same is true of any modern paganism that is closely allied to nationalism. It's just a kind of glorification of nationalism itself. That is the main thing, it seems to me. I'm not sure that they're terribly spiritual. They don't have any texts to follow, any priesthood, or anything. So they can simply declare themselves to be, Nordic nationalists or something.
Right. Well, I can see some of them seething with some of that, but I think it's a new religion. It's something. It's obviously not exactly what it was, but I think that. I got into Germanic paganism, and the deities have certainly called out to me. I've I feel a connection with them. But there's also, you get to a stage where there's a wall and you need to find more. It's a search, and I think we're going to have to reach out to some of these other places that had the same origins. I think that is the way forward, and it might be reaching out of ourselves and our cultural home to do it. But we're digging back to the roots of where it come from, and that's the only way we can really bring it back, I think, and get to the real depth of the spirituality of it all.
Right. If you really are religiously inclined, then you should try to understand the significance of these gods, Wotan and Thor and so on. And I have actually written one essay on the subject, on the Germanic gods, Wotan and Thor, in my new collection of essays, which is called Indo-European Mythology and Religion. It just came out from Australia a few weeks ago or something. Anyway, so you can learn about the significance of these gods and their similarity to our own gods. We have Vata in Iran, Vayu in India, and so on, and you will learn about the different powers in the evolving cosmos. They're all cosmic forces, so that you can learn. But how you will develop a personal relationship with these gods, I don't know. In India we have the same gods, like Vishnu and Shiva and so on. But everybody is, personally devoted to these gods through long tradition in the family and from generation to generation. So these are our gods, and there's no problem identifying with them or praying to them. Whereas you have to create these gods anew now. And how will you have this personal relationship with this god? That you first have to understand the significance of identity of, so it's really quite difficult, it seems to me. So all of this can be done, but how you develop a religious fervor, is another matter.
Yeah. I mean, you've written a lot about the rituals. I haven't had a chance to look deeply into your book because it's quite complex stuff, so I need to spend a bit of time with it. But it looks like you've really touched on some interesting stuff with that. Can we say, is it correct to say, like, if we look at like ancient Egyptian rituals, because if all these groups were ultimately seeded from the Indo-Europeans, then the ancient Egyptian rituals, or in Iran, India, then they all came from the same origin. Would that be correct?
Yes, I maintain that. And that is the Hamitic branch. The Hamitic branch is the youngest of all, and that includes the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. And they begin at the beginning of Kali Yuga, which is traditionally in India dated to around 3100 BC. And that is when these cultures flourished. So, yes, they also belong to it. They are late, but because they are latest, we have the clearest memory of them. Whereas all the others are, just fragments here and there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense to me. I'm no fan of this sort of cultural Marxist, universalist. Everything is lumped into one size fits all. But I do think that with this spirituality, particularly with the Germanic paganism, it does need to start. Me saying this, I know it's probably annoying people, but I think people have got to, if they're going to really recreate something spiritual, they've got to reach out to these other aspects and see the crossovers and try and work it out and get inspired by them to reignite it. That's definitely how I feel.
Right. By the way, talking about the Germans, I actually recently published a very interesting translation of Julius Langbehn. I don't know if you've noticed that among my books, it's called Rembrandt as Educator.
Oh, yeah.
And that was published also from England recently. And it is all about the North Germans. And you should read it. He's one of the proto-neoconservatives of Germany, and very traditional conservative. And if you read it, and I think all these Nordic nationalists or white nationalists or whatever they call themselves must read it, you will see how complicated such a nationalism really is. It is not simply a matter of going to some rituals and dressing up in SS or loose robes or whatever you prefer. It is a matter of discipline and of great elevation of thought. And he discusses all of the cultural and political aspects of the North Germans and what their excellence particularly consists in. the North Germans are the Danes and the Nordics and the North Germans themselves, Dutch also, and the English. And he points to them as being extremely suited for ruling. That is why they provided all of the kings and queens of the dynasties of Europe and so on. But there are many other aspects. And finally, he became a Catholic, and the conclusion of his work is a praise of Catholicism as a unifying force in Europe. So this is Langbain, who is actually a Nordicist, if you like. And there's no incompatibility between, being a Scandinavian and being part of a Europe which has flourished under Christianity. In fact, it was called Christendom, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's the thing is, when I look at Christianity, I mean, I used to, when I was in my naive years, I used to just slag off Christianity and say, all the usual cliches to slag it off. As I've got older and done a bit more research and just had a bit more of a mature mindset on things, I don't feel the need to attack it so much, because I look at it and I think, actually, there are some very, there's a lot of problems that there's been a lot of historical issues, it's done some wrongs and so on, but there's also something about the text that I can't completely brush off, more the New Testament. And even with the New Testament, you can see crossovers even to ancient Egypt. So is there anything in your research or your personal opinion that the New Testament may actually even have been inspired by some Indo-European spirituality itself?
Well, of course. Yeah. I mean, the Bible was composed only during the Babylonian exile, which is 6th century BC or something. That means the Jews had all been exiled away from their home and in contact with Babylonian scholars and Mesopotamian and so on and so forth. So they, learned from them. And while the people who were Orthodox Jews disregarded that mythology or reduced it to, a few pages in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, the others who were not Orthodox, the Nazarenes in particular, those sects that were not the mainstream Jews as well, then developed this religious system based on Indo-European cosmology around the story of Jesus. Probably there was somebody like that in Roman Palestine, and then they built the story around him. But you can see that it has many events that are not explicable humanly. For instance, for example, the Immaculate Conception and then the resurrection. All of these are not human events at all and can only be understood cosmologically through an understanding of the original forces that form the cosmos. So the Christ would correspond to Brahman in India, or Helios in ancient Greece, that is the light of the universe and the consciousness, perfect consciousness of it. And that is nous in Neoplatonism, which is the mind, as it were, the mind of the cosmos. And that is the Christ figure at a cosmic level. So there is a cosmic dimension to the entire story, which, of course, very few are interested in or understand. But that gives it its mystical quality, and even those who do not understand the cosmology, who go to the communion and believe that, the bread is being transformed into flesh and the wine into blood and so that, partake of a very mystical ceremony, which gives it its aura and its power. So it is like all the rituals of Egypt and the Dionysiac religion and everything.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, before we get into some of the political aspects and stuff, I just want to stick on this. Just another point I want to bring up as well, like with Christianity, is recently I've been researching about Gnosticism. I mean, we've had it on the show before, and it's like at the time the Gnostics were Christians, and it was kind of, there was a battle between this aspect, and a lot of the Gnostics were killed off, including the Cathars, not many years later. What's your views on Gnosticism? Do you think that was just a conflict in the distance that we don't really understand, or do you look at Gnostic texts now and do you think they're relevant to our spirituality as well?
I'm sure they're relevant to Christianity, but I haven't studied them in any detail, and they contributed to, the esoteric aspect of Christianity, just as Neoplatonism did. So I'm sure they're valuable, but I'm not an expert in Gnosticism.
Right. Okay. Well, you've also written, obviously, a lot about, we could sort of say, a controversial, or a lot of people would view as a controversial perspective on politics, at least in today's day and age anyway. But I think you probably could teach a lot of people about where a lot of these thoughts come from. Would you say a lot of your political writings are basically fascism, or do you think it's fascism as an overused term and it's you're coming from somewhere else?
Well, when I was doing my studies in natural philosophy and the book on it, I actually gradually moved to also the racialist theories of the thinkers of the National Socialist period, the Third Reich, Alfred Rosenberg, for instance, whose works I am very fond of. So he's written many essays which I translated. And so the Germans were particularly interested in the Aryan mythology and spirituality. Hans Günther, for instance, also wrote about Nordic religiosity and so on. So, through my studies in natural philosophy, I naturally moved into National Socialist politics itself. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Englishman who became a German, that was during the First World War, and he was also a champion of Nordic supremacy and so on, because he was a Norman and Nordic, actually. Anyway, he also did his doctoral or university research on the ascendance of the sap. The sap goes up the stem of a plant, disregarding gravity, and that was the basis of his research. And then he moved to, political essays and wrote about Germany's, superiority to even the English who had degenerated and so on. And he was a kind of a racialist thinker also, and a neoconservative, very interesting. And I've translated one of his works called Politische Ideale, the political ideals. So this movement from natural philosophy to political philosophy is not new. Chamberlain went through the same process. So then I translated not only Chamberlain, but Alfred Rosenberg, as I mentioned, and then another neoconservative of the Weimar Republic called Edgar Julius Jung, who wrote a book on the rule of the inferior. And then I worked on European political, German conservative foreign policy, actually, a collection of essays of various thinkers from the late 19th century to the early 20th, including the National Socialism. So there's a lot in National Socialism, and it's a theory that is admirable. And that is what I wanted to present to the world, because it had not been translated into English. And I wanted to be made available. So my first researches in fascism were in National Socialism, that aspect of the German part of it. But more recently, I have become interested also in fascism proper, which is the doctrines of Gentile and Evola and so on, who represent actually more systematic views on statecraft than the Germans, who are quasi-mystical and have a kind of interest in mythos, as they call it, and so on. The myth of the 20th century is the name of a book by Rosenberg. So there are two different parts of the Second World War. The National Socialists were more a kind of racialist, mystically oriented phenomenon, whereas the Italian fascists were actually more interested in statecraft. And so there's more to be learnt of politics from the Italians than from the Germans, I have come to realize.
Right. I mean, when we talk about fascism, I mean, a lot of people, what they use to refer to what fascism is they'll say it's. I think it was Mussolini that coined said this. He said that fascism is ultimately when big corporations come together with government to form one. I've always said that. I thought, well, that's not really describing what fascism is. That's more really describing how fascism gained power last century, because you can look at something like the EU, which is doing the exact same thing as what Mussolini was describing, big corporations coming together with a centralised power. But I wouldn't say that the EU is particular extreme nationalists. They're actually extreme anti-nationalists. So it's kind of a... so what's your... Well, let's go. What is fascism? Describe what actually is fascism? What's the ideology?
Well, fascism is a complete trust in the state, not in corporations, as you call it. It's corporate bodies. This is a cooperative system. It's not a corporate. Corporate is what we associate with corporations today, multinationals and so on. This is cooperative. Cooperative is related to corporate bodies like guilds and so on, representing professions and their various economic activities. So they only form part of the lower house. The upper house is constituted of statist politicians who actually run the state, and the state is more important than the corporate bodies in the other part of the parliament or whatever constitutional framework there is. So it's a glorification of the state, not of corporations. It has nothing to do with today's multinationals. There's a total confusion. It is the opposite of today's capitalist world, where corporations not just participate in the government, but actually rule over politics. And this is the horror that has to be reversed.
But wouldn't that, I mean, if you thinking about that, I mean, let's look at the National Socialists. I mean, they called themselves socialists. Obviously, all the left wingers today say they weren't socialists. But the thing is, surely with that big state power, that had a lot in common with communist authoritarian governments at the time. Isn't there an argument to say that the National Socialists, at least, and maybe all fascists for that matter, actually came forward with a left-wing ideology in that regard, just something slightly different than the lefties of the communists? Or would you agree with that?
Well, not all socialism is communist. It began with Proudhon and so on, who are not like communists or Marxists or anything. So Marx is just one variant to a very successful one, because the Jews are very adept at propagating their ideas. So they spread it rapidly, especially in Russia, where they had to liberate the Jews who were persecuted, and in the Pale or some special settlement that they could not leave. And so it was their primary task to liberate their fellows in Russia. And so they destroyed the entire Tsarist state and the Tsar's family as well and so on. So that is communism, and it's based on a very materialistic ideology that was propounded by Karl Marx. It's very different from National Socialism, which is not materialistic. It is racialist and also spiritual, insofar as they were sure that their own race was a very spiritual one, as I pointed out from my translations of Rosenberg and so on, even Elysium. So this is completely different. It has to do with special people, the European people in Germany, whereas in Marxism, it has to do with simply economic units of production or something. They're all herded into the factories, while a few people benefit from everybody else's activity.
Right. I mean, what would you say the difference is between the brand that the National Socialists used, and then you had the Fascists of Italy? Was it the same thing, or were there distinct differences?
Distinct, as I told you. Fascism is statecraft. It is based on very clear ideas of the state and the role of the state in the nation, whereas National Socialism was more racialist and believed that the people, simply the German people, could establish rule and supremacy by virtue of being Germans themselves. That itself was sufficient. They did not have any detailed views on the state. Carl Schmitt is a National Socialist theoretician, but he's only a theoretician. He's not a philosopher. He writes post facto treatises on dictatorship in order to justify Hitler's becoming a dictator, or National Socialist foreign political aims like aggression and so on, by saying in his concept of the political that all of politics consists in the difference between friends and enemies, so that way you can fight the enemies. This is just justification of what was happening in National Socialist Germany at that time. So he's only a theoretician, he's not a philosopher. But the fascists, Gentile in particular, were actually philosophers. And they propounded a very clear and very inspiring system of the state and how it should be constructed and rule the nation as a lasting institution.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
sorry.
Yeah, that's my point, yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's when people think of fascism. I mean, obviously, when people you throw the name around, obviously the Nazis are the most tainted sort of name because of World War II and so on, and the racist element. And I can understand from some people's point of view, particularly if you're of another race and all that, it's a very controversial ideology. But what I find is it's in the West particularly. I mean, maybe not so much in East Europe, I don't know, but you get, it's okay. It's almost like cool to be a communist. Communists had the same dictatorships. It was very authoritarian. A lot of people ended up dying. But you can kind of be cool with it and say, oh, you know what, I'm a communist, and you might get the odd dirty look, but you're okay. But when you mention the word fascism, that's almost like you're going to be knocking on the jail cell. Whereas in reality, okay, the Nazis had a controversial taking of it, and you can understand why people get offended by that. But fascism in itself, it's almost like doesn't get looked at as an ideology the same as communism does. And I think that's because generally fascism is like an extreme nationalistic way of thinking, and ultimately the globalists, the people that are controlling the world at the moment, want to eliminate nationalism. So they want fascism to be a swear word. I disagree. I'm not a fascist and I'm not a communist because I worry about if you have a dictatorship in power. If it's a good dictatorship, you could have fantastic results. But if it's a bad one, then you're in trouble. But we're kind of seeing that now anyway with the EU. I think people are looking at who's controlling the world at the moment. So it's a very precarious time at the moment because people are almost like starting to feel like they're in a dictatorship. So where do we go from here,
there are many dictatorships. Trump's presidency is a dictatorship, obviously, and so on. But it is the worst sort. Any capitalist system that puts forth a dictator is to be abhorred. And Trump is the worst of all dictators because he shouldn't have been president in the first place. So, right, you're talking about communism and National Socialism and fascism. These three are very different one from the other. Communism actually believed that the people, it's a fantasy, a utopia, but that the people would ultimately, gain power. They would own the means of production and become, masters of their businesses and industries and so on. And really wanted or said they would liberate the proletariat. They did not do anything practically in that direction in Russia because the Communist Party had total power and control. But that is, in any case, the ideology. National Socialism is very different. It worked with large corporations, the railways and all the big companies of that time, and actually got support even from some American banks or something at the initial stage, at least. So, no, it had no aversion to corporations. It's more of a capitalist system, but always with this racialist focus that only the Germans must rule. That is the difference. As for the Italians, they had no racialist theory at all. And as I said, they were more interested in statecraft and in restoring something like the ancient Roman Empire or something, which is commendable, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know if you go to Italy, It's still controversial, but it's less of a swear word out there than it is if you go to Germany or England or somewhere like that. But it's just, I find it's hypocritical around America and stuff like that. If you're going to get offended with fascism, then you've got to get offended with communism as well, because it just seems to be this unfair. The media do it as well. The media will interview a communist and they'll mock them and they'll kind of belittle them. But if you put a fascist on there, then they'd almost go mad at them. So it's just, it's a double standard in that regard.
It's not a double standard. It's just a total misunderstanding of the nature of these two systems. Communism is a completely economic system. It focuses on economic activity, production, and capital and labor, and then wants to make the proletariat the ultimate rulers, the dictatorship of the proletariat or something, which never happened. Whereas fascism is all about the spiritual role that the state has in the nation in order to elevate its population to a higher level. Because unlike communism, it's not a materialistic system at all. It's completely spiritual. So there's no confusion between the two. The state, of course, will be important in both, but the quality of the state and its constitution are completely different.
Okay, so, I mean, we're looking at the world today. I mean, at the moment in the UK, as I said earlier, we've got the EU, which are a lot of people. I think it's an ignorance. I know what they mean. They'll go, the EU are Nazis or they're fascists because they associate that anyone that's an authoritarian leadership must be fascist or must be Nazis and stuff. What is your view on the EU and what they are? What do you think they're up to, and how would you describe them as a group?
Well, the EU is not fascist or national socialist or anything. In fact, nationalist groups are working against the EU, like Marine Le Pen and Salvini and so on, right? Alternative for Deutschland and so on. No, these are the populists. These are the remnants of the nationalist socialist system, but very diluted and corrupt versions. Because they're not all German and they're not all systematic or disciplined or anything. They're simply, populist. And Trump belongs to that also. And they're all working against the EU, Trump included. And so the task now is to defend the EU against, whatever attacks that are being leveled against it. Because the EU is the only organization that holds Europe together. And Europe must be held together. It cannot last as individual nations. France or Germany or Slovakia or something like that, because they're too small and weak, and they have to form a confederation that is strong. Only the EU can do that. Of course, you don't have the best leaders. You have bankers, representatives everywhere, but it doesn't matter. They are still representing the union, which must be sustained.
Yeah,
so they are not the fascists. They're just trying to keep Europe together, following, some liberal democratic views that they've had for many years now. But never mind what their political system is. As a political entity, they have to be supported.
Oh, so you actually support the EU then?
Yes. By the way, I've also translated Jean Thiriart. He is another French European nationalist who died quite recently, actually. And he's written a book called An Empire of 100 Million Men, which seeks to create a new Europe and so on. And he insists on this. And he says all Europeans have to stop thinking of themselves as, Frenchmen or Italians or whatever, and think of themselves as Europeans. And he says that the creation of the European Union in the 50s is the first step towards this. It started as an economic community. It was the European Economic Community or something. But he says then it can also develop into a political one, which it is doing slowly. And once it gets an army, it'll be even stronger. So this is the only body that there is. I don't see what the choice is.
I kind of agree. I mean, if you don't, I think the EU is a good idea. If you think about what you've said, yeah, it's a good idea. But with the current people in place doing it, with their open border policy, and it seems they don't, if you look at Merkel, she was on stage and she took a German flag and threw it off the stage. In Britain, if you wave your flags, you're demonized as an extremist. So unless you're supporting the football, and then you're let off. But it's kind of this whole sort of philosophy that comes from the very liberal kind of mindset from the EU and stuff. I just think if at the moment it seems there's a lot of pro-nationalist parties like Salvini, Le Pen, as you say, they're polling quite high in the Euro elections. And if they were to really assert themselves and take control of it, then perhaps there'll be a bit more common sense behind it, a bit more respect for the nation states within it. But it seems at the moment that's just not there, and that's why so many people are opposing it and want to tear it down, because they don't think it's truly representing Europe as it should.
Well, it does. It represents Europe as nobody else does. Salvini and Le Pen are simply anti-immigrationist politicians. You see a few Africans on the streets and you get afraid, or a few Syrians, and you think they're going to blow up the entire place. All of this is just scare tactics. These are minorities that will remain minorities without power. And as regards globalism, now in this modern world, everything is already global. You're not going to change that. It depends on who is leading this globalist enterprise. And you think all your Salvini and Le Pen are independent. No, they're all Zionists. They're like national Zionists or something. And Zionism is an international movement also, but directed from Jerusalem or wherever they want to center themselves. And that is the worst sort of capitalism that you can imagine. Trump is part of this also. So, no, you should support the European Union against all these petty people who are backed by horrible forces in strange places.
All right, okay. So that's an interesting, because you're obviously, you write a lot about fascism, and you actually, this is a twist, because you're supporting the EU and not the people that usually people are calling the fascists. So,
right. Because I know what true fascism is and what true National Socialism is, and all of this is just a travesty of it.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay, so how do you see it playing out? Because at the moment, the EU isn't in a good position. You've got a lot of anti-feeling. How do you see it playing out? Do you think they're just going to have to step back and reform and try a different idea, or do you think? How do you see it playing out, basically?
Well, I'm completely opposed to the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, and everybody who's attacking, the system that exists at the moment, because you have to sustain a system rather than fragment it further. And I think that all these groupings that call themselves, nationalists, are only helping to fragment Europe, and this has to be stopped. As far as the later reorganization of Europe, it's already organized according to the European Union's rules, and it has a certain independence of America already, because America doesn't like the European Union, and neither does Israel, and so on and so forth. And if it can maintain its independence in spite of all these assaults, then it will emerge as a greater force. And it is the only force there is. Europe was the center of the world through the various colonial empires and so on, but also by virtue of its own elevated culture. It doesn't have the empires anymore, but it still has that capacity for culture that nobody else has in the West. And you have to support it. So now that the British are trying to leave with Brexit, this is a horror, because Britain was part of France for 400 years or something, ruled by the Normans, and derived all of the great culture of the Catholic Norman kings through them. So now you're going to cut off all relations with Europe, and then you only have America to fall back on. What is America? Which is Las Vegas or something. And the center of globalism, actually. This is a real absurdity that's actually frightful for you.
Right. Well, you've certainly given food for thought there. I think it's been very interesting, a lot of perspectives. I think there's probably a lot of people listening, thinking about this, because it's certainly a different perspective. But it's been fascinating having you on. And we're sort of getting towards that time now. Is there anything you'd like to address before we go? Any projects you've got coming up, or any other, or just something else you'd like to mention and bring up?
Well, no, I just finished the publication of that collection of essays on Indo-European mythology and religion, and sort of resting a little for the moment. But I'm not sure exactly what I need to do now. I've already done so many editions of European nationalist works and so on, and mythology as well. So I don't know exactly. I would probably study the Jewish question. I have studied it earlier from the German point of view, that is Eugen, Düring, and Alfred Rosenberg and so on. But I would be interested to find out more of the same subject from the Jewish, because there's a very interesting thinker called Hannah Arendt. I don't know if you know her. She was a friend of Martin Heidegger's. And she has also written on this subject. And that's something that I would like to learn more about, simply to complete my understanding of this problem, which is such a major one in today's world.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's certainly a subject that's not going away, and I think you've got to bring heads together and talk about it. I think obviously it's a lot of controversy and a lot of different views flying around with that. But we'd be happy to have you back on the show at some point in the future to address some other bits and pieces you're up to. Definitely got some interesting guests coming up, and perhaps we could bring you on with someone else at some stage as well, and really sort of go into some other subjects. Hopefully some controversial stuff as well, because that's what people like, I think, nowadays. So, but I really appreciate you coming on and spending your time on the show. It's been really interesting, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Indeed. Thank you very much.